Christian egoism. Is this a correct outlook? And if so, what are the implications for all of Christian life? You're listening to our exclusive monthly hangout for our podcast patrons. Find out how to become a patron at christianintellectual.com/Patreon. I'm Cody Leibold. I'll be interviewing Jacob Brunton, followed by a seminar discussion among all of our attendees. Here's what you need to know about For the New Christian Intellectual. This is a worldview project to combat blind faith, blind morality, and blind political conformity. We defend the biblical Christian teachings of rational faith, rational morality, and rational politics. Today's topic, the implications of Christian egoism. Is it right for Christians to be motivated by abundant biblical promises of gain and reward? And if so, how much so? And in what way? So our focus is, what does that look like applied to real life, the implications of Christian egoism? One way that you can always apply a sound doctrine to start out is just this, to rejoice. Rejoice because it's true and the truth is good. And the truth is, we do have a great reward. This is what Jesus says to Christians in the context of persecution. In Matthew 5:12, he says, "Rejoice and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven." So Jacob, that's a good place to start. And I think that might suggest some more ideas. Is the reward in heaven only? But let's talk about this. I would argue that because we have accepted the idea of Christian egoism, we are able to rejoice. And we are able to be more deeply thankful to God than if we hadn't, because we've accepted that he wants us to seek him and his gifts as personal values, because we consider it a reward for us and a treasure for us. So do you think I'm on the right track here?
Yeah, I think it's really important. That's one of it's probably the first key feature of what we're calling Christian egoism. And it's what we have in common with what Piper calls Christian hedonism, and that is that to genuinely value something, and in particular, to genuinely value God or the glory of God or the kingdom of God or the gospel, or whatever it is that the New Testament, for instance, is calling us to pursue and to value and to passionately and potentially lay down our lives for, in order to genuinely value those things, it means to hold them as a personal value to oneself. You can't genuinely value something if you don't see it as being of interest to you, of value to yourself. That's what it means to value something. And that's the first part of what we talk about when we're talking about Christian egoism. And that's what Piper really labors when he talks about Christian hedonism, is that you don't truly value or love something or someone that you don't take any joy in, that you don't take any pleasure in, right? And he uses the example of taking his wife out on a date because it's his duty. And I would elaborate on that and say, the opposite idea would be like saying to my wife, I take no pleasure in you. I could be just as happy with any other woman, which Matt Chandler has said that, by the way, about his wife. He's preached that as if that's a good thing. I could be just as happy with any other woman. I take no personal pleasure in you. I have no self-interest in your well-being. I'm just doing this because I'm supposed to. And calling that value, right? So one of our major arguments for Christian egoism, one of our major convictions, is that is not genuine value. That is cold-hearted, stoic, Kantian hypocrisy. And in fact, that's what we see Jesus condemning as hypocrisy in the New Testament. He says, you worship me with your mouths, but your hearts are far from me. Or God says that to his people Israel. And Jesus talks about being whitewashed tombs, or cleaning the outside of the cup, but the inside of the cup is filthy. What is the inside of the cup? What's the inside of the tomb? It's your heart. It's your affections. It's what you truly and genuinely value. And the point is, you can't claim to value something, even if you do all the right actions that would go along with actually valuing that thing, if inside you take no personal pleasure in it. You take no personal joy in it. You don't have any selfish, quote unquote, interest in it. So that's the first leg of what Christian egoism wants to emphasize, that it's that we need to personally invest in those things that are good, true, holy, and beautiful. And if we don't have a deep, vivid, self-interested joy and pleasurable response to those things that are good, true, holy, and beautiful, then we know that there's something wrong in our hearts. And likely there's something wrong in our minds, and we need to figure out how to fix that. And so that's one of the things we can talk about is if we don't find the appropriate affections in our hearts for a given thing that we know that we're supposed to have positive affections for, how do we fix that? I think that's a really important topic that we can discuss. And if anybody has specific examples, I would love to kind of ferret them out. Because it's going to be that there's going to be a general way of approaching it, but it's also going to vary on a case-by-case basis. Go ahead, Cody.
Jacob, on that topic of desire, one of the things that Kant is most famous for saying is that there is a difference between the moral worth of a person doing a good deed who doesn't want to do it or desire it versus someone who does. And he ascribes a sort of like a heroism, a moral import to the person who wishes to be a thief but chooses not to be a thief. Now, I can understand partly why he started thinking along those lines, because to resist temptation is a morally good action. But if you were to compare that to being of the kind of moral character where you were never tempted in the first place, that's an even better moral action. It's actually kind of absurd. If Kant is a Christian, what is he saying about Jesus's morality? Jesus was free from the desire to sin, although he was tempted in an external form of temptation, but the internal temptation, I don't think was there. I don't think that he ever seriously for a moment considered saying yes to Satan. In light of like the Revoice conference that's going on right now as we speak, this is an important topic.
Yeah, and this is, I don't know all the full connections with the Revoice conference, so maybe you can elaborate on that in a second, but this is also a big problem with the Trinity. If you think about the inter-Trinitarian love between the Father and the Son and the Spirit, on Kant's view, and this is also the problem with the view of libertarian free will, the idea that you must have libertarian free will in order for your actions to be of moral value or of moral import, right? So the question is, can the Father stop loving the Son? Is he able, quote unquote, is he free, quote unquote, to stop loving the Son? And the answer, hopefully we would all affirm, is absolutely not. It's not possible. Well, then does that mean that his love is therefore that much less valuable? Right? There's this idea that in order for love to be genuine, in order for any moral action to be genuine, you have to be, quote unquote, free to do otherwise. And Kant seems to be saying even to the point of you need to be strongly tempted to do otherwise in order for the action or the love or the affection or whatever to be genuine. And that just goes completely contrary to the Trinity. So this strikes at the heart of Christian theology, and that should be a huge red flag as to why we should really doubt it. It may sound appealing for the reasons you listed, Cody, because it's right to resist temptation, but the fact that this makes the Trinity illogical and it makes the Father's love for the Son and the Son's love for the Father non-valuable or less valuable should make us pause and say, wait a second, there's something bad going on here, and Kant's making a very dangerous leap from a reasonably good impulse to resist temptation to the conclusion that moral worth is wrapped up in resisting temptation as such.
Jacob, I was going to add that you and I have been very impressed with some of the things that John Piper has said on this topic. And in Brothers, We Are Not Professionals, he has a chapter on this question of Kantian morality. And C.S. Lewis also has a section where C.S. Lewis talks about, this is in Mere Christianity, he talks about this perspective that has come to us from Kant, that the essence of a good, virtuous character is unselfishness. And I'd like to bridge over to this topic of self and unselfishness, because this is where it becomes really contentious. I mean, we find ourselves agreeing with Edwards, Lewis, and Piper, and we believe with Scripture. But what are the implications for us as we look at our own self? Should we value ourself? And is there a right way to do that? Is there a wrong way to do that?
Yeah, and that's the other major strand of what we advocate as Christian egoism. And this is, I think, the thing that likely separates what we're calling Christian egoism from what Piper calls his Christian hedonism. Because in Piper's Christian hedonism, he focuses primarily on what we were just talking about, the fact that to genuinely value something, you have to see it as valuable to yourself, right? So there's sort of the subjective component of there needs to be genuine affections there, right? And that's what Piper really emphasizes, and we want to agree with that. But then in addition to that, we want to go a step further and say there is an appropriate sense in which we ought to value ourselves. And this is where this is more of an objective approach of seeing ourselves as an object of value, right? So does that distinction make sense to you guys? And what I want to say here is I think there's a good hesitation on the part of most Christians to say, whoa, I'm not sure I want to talk too much about valuing myself because there are a lot of warnings in Scripture against valuing yourself too highly, or against arrogance, or what many people today would call pride, although I think it's more appropriately called arrogance, where you value yourself more than you value God, or you value yourself more than you ought to, or you think too highly of yourself, as Scripture says. So there's an appropriate fear as we approach this topic, but it's important not to let that fear blind us to the reality that it is necessary for us to value ourselves rationally. And what that means is we ought to value ourselves according to our objective value. Specifically, our objective value in the pursuit of what is ultimately objectively valuable, namely God and his glory, right? So let's take Piper's Christian hedonism. God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in him. And so we're going to latch on to, yes, I want to be satisfied in God. And the way I'm going to do that is by seeking his glory. I want him to be glorified. I want him to be glorified to the max in my life. And here's where this other part of Christian egoism comes in. My life? Why should I care so much about my life? Isn't that selfish? Right? I want God to be glorified in my life. And in order to do that, I am going to have to do a number of very specific things to maximize the effectiveness of my life. I'm going to have to improve the quality of my life in certain ways. I'm going to have to pay a lot of attention to my life to make sure that my life is doing what I want it to be doing and not what I don't want it to be doing. And in order to do all that, I have to count my life as valuable. I have to care about it. You don't keep a close eye over that which you do not care about. You don't carefully manage and cultivate that which you don't care about. And so in order for my life to maximally glorify God, I have to care about it. I have to not be concerned that I'm being, quote unquote, arrogant every time I think about what's the best thing for me to do for my life, especially if that is aimed at maximally glorifying God in my life. Go ahead, Cody.
In our recent discussion, Jacob, this is something that you said. Christian egoism means valuing yourself as a redeemed image of God, and it means earning and taking pride in the person you are and the life you live. And then you outlined a couple of things that you need to do. So let's go to that. The first one was, you said you have to be severely rational with yourself. Can you elaborate?
Yeah. Well, and real quickly, before we get to sort of that outline, I want to give a broader picture outline of what the self is. What is myself, right? Fundamentally, I am a spiritual, physical being created in the image of God. And the spiritual aspects of myself are my mind, my affections, and my will. And those translate in action, in life, into judgments that I make with my mind and convictions that I form over a long period of time with my mind, values that I pursue with my affections, and the life that I live and that I lead with the actions that I take. And so there's a long range over the course of time course to this thing called me or myself, and it includes my life over a period of time. It includes the judgments that I've made. It includes the values that I've developed and the things that I've pursued and the way that I've gone about pursuing those things. And so if I've neglected something that I shouldn't have neglected, it's going to have a negative impact on my life. If I pursue something and value something that I shouldn't value and pursue, it's going to have a negative impact on my life. And if I don't have my values in the proper hierarchy, that's going to have a negative impact on my life. If I don't know how to make rational judgments, or if I'm not in the habit of making rational judgments, that's going to have a negative impact on my life. So all of these things that are essential to myself, my mind, my affections, and my will, and in translation, my judgments and convictions, my values and affections, and my actions over a long period of time, all of these things are wrapped up in what it takes to maximally glorify God in my life. And I've got to have very passionate care about those things in order to make sure that they don't go off track, because they can and will very easily go off track. And I think this is what the Bible talks about when it talks about self-control and the virtue of self-control. It's having control, conscious, conscientious, caring, valuing, passionate control over the totality of oneself and one's life. And you're not going to do that if you don't care about it. And then what Cody was getting into there is one of the first ways that we can start doing that. One of the first ways we can start cultivating care for ourselves is through being severely rational with ourselves, right? So we all have a tendency, because of sin, we all have a tendency to let our affections run ahead of our reason. It's possible and unfortunately probable that we will justify an action or a course of actions or a life decision or even a career choice based off of potentially irrational affections rather than based on rational consideration and judgment. And so the first thing that we need to do to make sure that we don't make shipwreck of our lives, of our faith, and of our mission to glorify God maximally with our lives is to be severely rational with ourselves. It's to basically say, Jacob, get your damn head on straight. Stop letting your emotions rule you. And often the emotion ruling you might be fear. And it can be easy to think that that's an innocent emotion, right? Because then I'm being a victim. And it's easy to let fear rule you or rule your decisions because you think, well, I'm a victim of it and therefore I'm not responsible for it. No, you're still responsible for it. It's still going to have an effect on your life, and you are responsible for your life. You solely are responsible for your life and what you choose to do with it and how you choose to give in to fear or to fight it. And the only way to fight fear or any other irrational desire is with reason. It's with rationality. And so you've got to be severely rational with yourself, which means you've got to know how to be rational. You've got to know how to judge potential decisions that you might make or even affections that you might have by right reason. And there's a whole study needed for how to do that. You know, this is where epistemology comes in. This is where thinking rationally about Scripture and general revelation and all these things and how they connect and what the implications are comes in. This is it's not easy. There's definitely an art and a science to this, but this is one of the first things that's needed.
You also suggested setting challenging but somewhat realistic goals can be an important part of this. So that could be a goal of a course of study, or even just to read a certain amount of books per year. But it's going to be the goal to have friendships with people that challenge you and that sharpen you. It's also going to be the goal to spend your time reading the Bible and in prayer and reflecting, taking the time that it takes to become the person that God is wanting you to be.
Yeah. And think of holy self-improvement here, right? There's a lot of frilly self-help books on the market. Don't let that caricature of the surface level banal self-help industry deter you from deep, substantive, holy, eternally minded self-help and self-improvement, because that's what we should be aimed at. That's the Christian. That's sanctification. It's improving your true, eternal, holy self, so that you will be more fit for eternity and more fit for bringing eternity to this life. That's the goal as a Christian. And so do think about how you can improve yourself and challenge yourself and set goals that challenge yourself in all those ways that Cody listed and others. Think about your career. If you don't know what you want to do as a career, set a challenge for yourself to figure it out, and then set steps for how you're going to figure it out. If you've got a career already on guide, or you're already on track with a career, but you've got other aspirations that you feel like God's calling you to, set goals for yourself on how to accomplish those things, and then make a game plan and do your best to work at accomplishing it. And then let that accomplishment, to whatever degree you are able to accomplish it, fuel you on to further and further accomplishments.
Jacob, I was going to add this whole idea of setting goals and achieving them. If somebody is on the Kantian perspective of duty-based morality and they are not having the value-oriented moral system that you're describing, it's a lot easier to make excuses of why my career is going nowhere, or the other major value in life is a romantic relationship. And so a productive career and a romantic relationship, if you want those things, which you should, it's going to take intentional steps forward. When I decided that I was 25 and I was single, I went to 3 different churches every week until I met someone. That's the steps that I took. And when I hear people saying, "Oh, I think that when it's time, God will bring somebody to me," I just think, well, no, that's not how life works. That's not how morality works most of the time. And unless you've had God tell you that that's what he wants you to do, you can probably assume that's not what he wants you to do.
Yeah, and on that point in particular, it's really important to invest heavily in improving yourself if you want to have a healthy romantic relationship. Because, and you've got to read Rand on this if you haven't, you need to earn their respect, their love, their admiration. It needs to be a reward. It needs to be a reflection of the character that you've built in yourself. Because if it's not, then it's going to be duty based or pity based or something else that's really, really ugly, and it's going to deteriorate very quickly. It might be nice at first, but it will eventually deteriorate. And so it's really, really important to build a long-term romantic relationship, and especially a marriage, on a value-oriented view of the relationship, where I am building value in pursuing the kingdom of God. I'm doing everything I can to improve my life as much as possible. And the ideal is that she, whoever she is attracted to that. And that everything kind of happens naturally as a result of that.
One of the blessings of this Christian egoism concept is that it helps you get rid of some feeling of internal hypocrisy or contradiction when you're looking at qualities of somebody else. I don't know if you guys have seen recently, there was this article, somebody wrote an article that if you're looking for a Christian husband, you might want to think about not having this or this or this in your past. And it wasn't really that great of an article, but what's hilarious was how many people took offense at the article. And then it became this parody where you see this parody article where people are writing a different version of the article, but it's from the man's perspective, or it's from the woman's perspective about a man. And it says, newsflash, Christian women are not looking for this or this or this. And it just took off because we realized there's this hypocrisy or this feeling of like there's some kind of internal contradiction as Christians. Should we be looking for somebody who is really, really great and who we see as a value? And is that okay? Do I feel good about myself doing that? Or do I feel like I'm just being grabby or greedy? And I can tell you, when I was a teenager, this was really hard for me. Accepting the fact that I wanted to pursue values and knowing where that was right or wrong and how it was right or wrong, that was difficult.
Yeah, let me just jump in and say that the problem with that article, or with the set of articles now, it is not that it's encouraging the idea of having standards for relationships. I think that the problem was having arbitrary standards in the sense of looking at one's past without the context or without regard to one's present, right? So someone can have a really horrible past and yet in spite of that have made up for it, so to speak, by building a really strong virtuous character since then. And our focus should be on the present person and their present character and the trajectory that they're going in towards the future, not on what might have happened in the past.
So let's go on to the next topic that you brought up, which was finding a healthy church. Now, this can be a real challenge. If you affirm Christian egoism and you go to almost any church on any Sunday, you're going to hear selfishness denounced. You're going to hear that people should not use their own autonomous human reason. You're going to hear things like this. And you're going to hear, the pastor supporting, we need to have everybody paying all these taxes that we're paying. And that's the right thing. That's just your duty. You're going to hear all these things that are kind of bothering your soul. So what's your advice?
Yeah. So the first thing is, I think one of the most important things for me, as I've dwelled on the concept of Christian egoism and just dwelled on scripture, is the idea of self-sufficiency, or maybe a more holy way to put it would be God's sufficiency, although that's sort of a given in the Christian life, right? So, but the idea is, yes, it's good to have community, and I don't want to be taken as denying that. In fact, the ideal is being in community and having deep, genuine, lasting relationships in the context of the church. That there's no question about it. That is the ideal in the New Testament. But that doesn't mean that there won't be contexts in which that is just not possible. That happens. And that happened in Scripture to many a saint. And I think that the image the Bible puts forth for us for when we find ourselves in that situation is an image of what we might call individualism and self-sufficiency in terms of our relationship with God. Meaning, if everyone else around me is going to be pursuing irrationalities and things that I consider to be evil, I have the responsibility before God not to let that touch the most inner parts of my soul. I have the responsibility to stay true to what I know is true and to cultivate my own passions and my own values for God and the things of God in spite of that, however hard it might be. And it is really hard. I mean, I've gone through this at most of the churches we've been at. It is really difficult and it can be very lonely, but it's also potentially one of the times of sweetest growth with the Lord because of you leaning into him so heavily and not having those other potential crutches of other people, right? So it can be a true blessing. And I think we see instances of that throughout Scripture, if you look at David especially in the Psalms. And so I would say, if you are feeling like a outcast or rejected or lonely, I would say dig into the Psalms at the very least, and identify with David and with Christ on the cross, and with Paul being rejected and despised on his missionary journeys and things like that, and learn how to be a Christian by yourself. Because while that's not the ideal, it is necessary. Go ahead, Cody.
Oh, you also were talking about advice for how we should be looking for, this is the church I'm going to join. These are the friends in my local area that I'm going to be friends with. So I thought you had some great points on that. And you distinguish between, the first danger to look out for is if somebody's just, pounding every week, selfishness is bad, and they don't want to have a conversation with you. It may get to the point where you're just like, well, I need to find somebody else to be my pastor. But you also made this distinction between, sometimes people will say something because they've heard it as a phrase that is accepted by others, and they haven't really thought through it in depth. And they may explicitly state the idea from time to time, but that's different from who they are deeply. Can you go into that?
Yeah. So, and that I wanted to set the context for that. So the independent mindset or the self-sufficiency mindset is necessary at the outset, right? As you go into the church environment. So you need to have that up front. But then as you go into the church environment and try to find a good church or try to build relationships within the church that you're already in, it's important to be rational and don't have too thin of skin, right? You need to have a little bit of thick skin when it comes to these ideas. You need to prioritize what's important and what's essential versus what's not as important, not as essential, in terms of the ideas being discussed or the convictions held. But then even when you are talking about something that's really important, like for instance, self-interest, or the virtue of capitalism, maybe, right? So we would hold those things to be really important. You still can have fellowship with people who, at least on the surface, disagree with you on those things, because it's not always the case that people who say that they disagree with those things deep down actually do, right? Rand talks about this thing that she calls a sense of life, and a lot of people have a sense of life, a fundamental internal way that they react towards the world that is different from their explicitly stated convictions, right? So you might have somebody who, we see this all the time within Christianity. You've got people who claim that they love Jesus, but then they never act like it. And they certainly don't have affections that are in line with that, right? But then there are people who, maybe it's a brand new Christian and they don't know a whole lot about Jesus. They don't know a whole lot about theology, but man, they've got the affections. Man, they've got the right spirit, right? That's the way we might put it in the church, in Christianese. I think that's the same sort of phenomenon that Rand's pointing out. You can have someone who has those deep internal positive reactions towards, say, personal achievement, or having an ultimate positive value orientation. And yet they might condemn capitalism as evil. They might actually say explicitly capitalism is evil, or we shouldn't be selfish. But deep down they don't really believe it, because, and the way you can tell is because they don't feel guilty for doing self-interested things. That they take care of their family, and they don't. If a beggar comes and asks them for their son's lunch money or whatever, that they don't feel any guilt in saying, no, I'm not going to give you my son. That belongs to my son, right? That person has a level of self-respect and a level of value for the self and for the soul that we ought to recognize, even if he doesn't recognize it, right? And so it's important to make that distinction and understand some people need some help with their thoughts catching up with their good feelings or with their good sense of life. Does that make sense? And those are people that we can befriend. Those are people that are potential allies, that we can talk to and say, hey, in fact, it strikes me, those are people that are an awful lot like Dagny and Reardon in Atlas Shrugged, right? Dagny and Reardon in Atlas Shrugged have the right sense of life, but they've got all the wrong ideas. And what the strikers are helping them to figure out is to help them figure out the right ideas, especially Reardon, right? And so that's what we need to try to focus on as we build relationships, both within the church and without, but I think especially within the church, is find people who have the right sense of life, and work on befriending them. And that doesn't mean you can't befriend others. You don't have to be super dogmatic, but if you want to really build on a close group of friends that you can lean on, I think those people who have a right sense of life, regardless of what they explicitly say, are a huge potential value.
All right, so we're at the point in this conversation where I'd like to open up the floor, and we're going to do more questions, seminar style, involving as many of the people that are on the call right now as possible. So we've got some questions that will help us guide the discussion. And Jacob, I also wanted to mention that there's one other major point that you made, and we'll bring that up at the end as an implication of, if Christian egoism is true, an action point that we can all take. So here's what I'll say is, let's talk through some of the challenges that have come up for each of you individually. And as many people as want to answer, just a real brief, like 1 or 2 sentences. What are some of the challenges that this idea has given in your life, or some of the implications in your life? Who wants to go first?
I would love to go first.
Go ahead.
So I think in my life, I've started to change the way I look at a lot of things. And as Jacob talked about, like, hey, you can't jump down everybody's throat because they don't quite agree with you. And like, for me, these are very new ideas. They're not ideas that I've grown up with. I've always been raised to think very differently. But I think it's just like, if I meet somebody on the street, like, or if I meet another Christian, they might not know everything about creation, which is important to me. But hey, they're growing, and that's something I've always appreciated with you and Jacob, that you've always been very patient with learning new ideas. But I think for my life, like, I've started to look around and say, hey, what good does it do if I'm always on here trying to make YouTube videos and trying to make content, if I end up dying at 35? Well, what do I want for my life? I want to go get a good career in science. I want to go get a PhD. I want to, build myself up, and that's good because that's going to build my credibility. And me building my own life, that's going to spill over to others. And like, I want to make sure that I'm, being healthy, taking care of, my own body that God has given me, and, taking care of my own mind. And, because at the end of the day, I'm the only person whose life I really truly have control over. And if my life is falling to pieces, it's a bad witness. It's bad for myself. And, if I want to help others, if that were my goal, if that is my goal, then I do need to help myself. I'm not trying to turn that into an altruistic argument, but it does, kind of put the facts on the table there.
Greg, that's really good advice you're sharing. That reminds me of the principle of the air mask on an airplane. If you're sitting next to somebody else, you put your own air mask on first, even if your goal is ultimately that you put it on the other person. All right, who's next? We've got Colin. You want to go?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I had to unmute myself there. Jacob mentioned something that it really struck me as a pastor, the importance of being independent and having that self-sufficient mindset, I wrote it down. Learn how to be a Christian by yourself. You know, as a pastor, the guy that everybody in the church kind of looks to, you know, and it is extremely important to be patient with people who do have that right sense of life, but have the wrong ideas. And sometimes I'm ready for people to pick up and let's start running when you've got to teach them to, you know, walk a little bit before you can. And that's something that I've learned as a pastor, and just the importance of being able to do church by yourself, to be able to reach out within yourself. And like you said about David, relying so heavily on the Lord. That really struck me. That was one of those things that, you know, you kind of feel in your subconscious, and then somebody comes along and articulates it, and you're like, yeah, I know exactly what you're saying, but I've never articulated it like that before, but I feel that, you know. So anyway,
Yeah.
thank you for that. I appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the ideal for a healthy relationship is a relationship out of abundance rather than a relationship out of need. And if we feel like we need the church, we need other Christians, we need fellowship for our own spiritual health, then it's going to end up being an unhealthy relationship. You know, it's going to be sort of a codependent type relationship. And we're going to be disappointed because they're going to let us down. They are not Jesus. They are not God. And so while we absolutely need to affirm with the Bible that having those healthy and abundant relationships with people in the church is the ideal, we also need to affirm that we can't make our own spiritual health dependent on that. We need to take responsibility for our own spiritual health and our own spiritual lives. And like you said, learn to be a Christian by yourself with just you and God, and pray for and seek healthy relationships as an overflow of that, but never as a substitute for that.
Right.
Hey, Jacob, do you mind if I give you a little pushback on that?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think sometimes I'll take things that are said like kind of to an extreme. But are you talking about in terms of having like a dry season where you might have a moment where, hey, I'm almost picturing an Old Testament prophet of God standing in front of the pagan empire, and Israel was worshiping the pagan gods with them. And in our lives, we might have a dry season where we might have it where we're not having fellowship with other Christians. Maybe we moved away to a new town, or perhaps there's some conflict within the church that's needed. But at the same time, like I think there was a movie called Castaway, and I think it was Forrest Gump. Whoever played Forrest Gump was in it. And he was like on this deserted island for like 5 years, and he ended up having his best friend be a soccer ball. I've never watched the whole thing. I don't want to watch that. That's awful. How would you, psychologically and spiritually, I think we do need fellowship. We need other Christians. We need other people in our lives. Like, we're not designed to be alone. So how would you respond to that with those two potential points of tension?
Two tracks of response. The first, it is true that God said it is not good for man to be alone. So it is not good. It is not ideal. However, I don't think that means that it's not possible to be alone and stay spiritually healthy. It's just really, really difficult. Right? So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing is that we often are not in that extreme of a situation. Often we have relationships that just aren't as healthy or as deep as we would like them to be, or as they should be, right? Or it might be that we've got deep fellowship regarding some things, but not regarding other things. And maybe these other things that we are lacking fellowship in are more important or are deeper, right? And so it might be that you're not completely ostracized from society or even completely ostracized from the church. But there still can be a deep sense of longing for a deeper form of fellowship that is ideal in the church, but that you're not getting. And you've got to learn how to cope with that. And I'm speaking from personal experience here. I was at Bethlehem Baptist Church in Minneapolis, John Piper's church, right? So I had, Reformed theology in common with them. I had Christian hedonism in common with them. And yet I felt like a complete outcast almost the entire time I was there.
Why?
In small groups, because they looked at me like I had two heads whenever I said I was interested in philosophy. Right? So my life passion is Christian philosophy. That's what I was working on. That's what I was studying for. That's what I was writing all my papers on. And everybody looked at me like I had two heads. Nobody had the conceptual tools to even understand why I would want to do that. And that was really lonely. Like that was really, really difficult. I felt very alone in respect to my central calling in life. I felt like nobody understands my calling. And because of that, they can't support me in my calling. They can't pray for me in pursuing my calling. They can't come alongside me and encourage me in it. All these things. And especially when you compare that to the way that, the future pastors and missionaries were being supported and encouraged in their calling, so that you can get envious, right? And so we do have a deep psychological need, and it can be in different respects for different things, whether it's for your calling or for something you're going through in life or whatever it might be. And you could be missing the type of fellowship that God wants for his people in respect to that thing. And it's really, really important and valuable to learn to go without that, even though it would be ideal for you to have it. Go ahead, Cody.
So I'd like to ask the remaining people, and it's okay if you don't have anything that you wanted to add to the question, but just a reminder, the question was, what are some of the challenges or the implications in your own life of Christian egoism? So I'll start by asking Matt, and then I'll ask Shireen, and then I'll ask Tony. So Matt, did you have anything on that one?
Nothing in particular right now. Still kind of processing.
All right. How about Shireen?
Hi, Cody. Yeah, so I just have to say that in a nutshell, my entire life has been a challenge with Christian egoism, in the sense that I naturally, from my earliest memories, I was a Christian egoist. I guess I just could not have articulated it that way as I was growing up, but everybody and everything around me was the entire opposite. It seemed like I grew up all my life, excuse me, being told that egoism is bad and selfishness is bad. And within the Christian circles that I was raised in, it was not just frowned upon, it was looked on with horror, as if you were like an alien from another planet or something. So I find that, now as an adult with 4 kids, I find that same strain of thought or worldview seems to have kind of followed me everywhere, and it's just so prevalent. So my struggle, it's not so much a struggle, because I honestly, before I met this group and you guys, I just sort of gave up on any kind of trying to propound my worldview, or even kind of saying, hey, I believe in the virtue of selfishness, or I'm a Christian egoist, or whatever. I just kind of stopped kind of sharing that with other people, and kind of just kept it to myself and my own journals. So then it stopped being a struggle, because I kind of stopped trying to prove, but, just within myself, I said to myself, oh, I know I'm right, kind of thing. I just moved on with life. So that's basically, I know that's not a very that sounds like a pretty gloomy outlook, but I've only now begun to kind of, reach out, mainly because of this group that I found. I've only now begun to, realize that there are other people out there who do think like me and basically have a framework or a philosophy that they are sharing, a framework that I can actually understand. So that's basically where I am.
Thank you for sharing that, Shireen. I wanted to ask you two questions. And one is, how does this play into your aspirations as a writer? And also, how does it play into your mindset as a parent?
That's very interesting. Well, I would say the answer to the first question is much easier than the second one. So my aspirations as a writer, this observation of, everybody seeming to be always harping on about unselfishness or selflessness, that doesn't have, so far has had no bearing on my calling as a writer. So I think writing, thankfully so, is first of all a very solitary activity, and it's a solitary craft, and I think by its very nature needs to be so. It's basically an expression of me. Whatever comes out on paper, whether it's a short story or a novel, or what the topic or the genre is, it doesn't really matter as long as I know I'm being true to the voice within me. So in that sense, I don't think, in a certain sense, writing can be learned. And so I think me writing and knowing that I am a writer has actually strengthened my individuality in a way. It's made that struggle that Jacob was talking about. It is pretty lonely when you think that, hey, at some point it's better to just take a step back and not reach out to community for some reason or another. I mean, you don't become antisocial, but you just take a step back. So I think writing has actually helped me to bear that kind of thing, So the writing hasn't been negatively impacted or impacted in any way by this. But me being a parent, now that's a different story altogether. I am really struggling with the fact that, my kids are kind of young and impressionable. And I think like most other kids around Northern Virginia who go to public schools, they are being taught that selfishness is bad. I mean, and it's come to the point where they have to be very politically correct about everything they say. So I'm really, excuse me, I'm just chuckling because it's kind of an irony, but my kids have sometimes said, oh, Mom, oh, you're so weird, or, like just things like, oh, you're so racist. But they'll be very affectionate when they say it. But I feel like my kids genuinely believe that I'm, I'm like some one-person cult or something, because my beliefs are so different that they always, I mean, it's kind of a struggle, and it seems a little funny now because they're young enough, but, I always wonder what will happen if they kind of grow up and go to college, which they will, and continue to be surrounded by and internalized by that point of time, just all of these altruistic, things just floating around. But I don't have a solution to that as yet. I just try to talk to them, and, it is a struggle. I mean, we don't argue or fight or anything, but we have a lot of philosophical discussions. My oldest is 17, and especially with my 17-year-old, she is well-read and very articulate and deeply interested in philosophy. But, I hear her saying things like, oh, Ayn Rand doesn't make any sense and things like that. So, I mean, we're at the point where I'm just having these heated intellectual discussions with my 17-year-old. Yeah.
I can imagine that you are having a much deeper impact on them long-term than you can just see right now. And they're going to be so grateful for the impact that you're having on them a couple years down the line when they start thinking about it and they realize the consequences of the ideas that they've seen in the world. So I love, it's so encouraging to hear that story. Thank you, Shireen. And I was going to go over.
All right, thank you.
Tony, did you also have one that you wanted to share?
Yes. Of course, in dealing with altruistic interpretations of the Bible and dealing with non-Christians who are also altruistic, that's, of course, always a challenge. However, another challenge is dealing with people who do actually gravitate toward the idea of selfishness and don't really have a problem agreeing that selfishness is good. However, their view of selfishness may be unholy or unhealthy view of selfishness, or it may be like kind of a prosperity gospel kind of view of selfishness. So it's kind of like a double challenge, because there's those who vehemently disagree with me when I talk about selfishness being a virtue, but then there's also those who do agree, or can get on board with the idea of selfishness being a virtue, but then have a misaligned view of that. So it's like two battles going on at once.
How do you typically respond to that second one?
Well, I usually respond with questions to kind of draw out the fact that immature selfishness or unholy selfishness is actually not good for the self. So yeah, questions that kind of lead to realizing, or having to admit that that selfishness, immature selfishness is not a good thing.
Well, we have about 10 more minutes left for this call. And what I wanted to do is go through a couple of questions that we received. And this one is actually from you, Tony. It's one that you messaged me. When we think about our egos, what do we need to be careful with? Jacob, what are your thoughts on that one?
Muted. I'm unmuted. Can you hear me now? All right. Let me tie this into what Tony just mentioned about the prosperity gospel. I think there's a really unfortunate dynamic where on the one hand, we've got the prosperity gospel. On the other hand, we have what I would call the poverty gospel. The prosperity gospel says that we should value trash, and the poverty gospel says that we shouldn't value it all. And no one wants to stand up and say, no, let's value things that are actually valuable. And I think Tony kind of hinted at that when he said, when he made the distinction between immature selfishness and mature selfishness. I think a more accurate description would be irrational versus rational selfishness. That's the way Rand would describe it. Or, you could use a description that you also use, Tony, holy versus unholy. The prosperity gospel focuses merely on material wealth and not even seeing it as wealth or as production, but just as the products of wealth. And so it's very irrational. And I think you can get the irrationality of it from just reading Rand, even apart from a biblical worldview. So I think that's helpful there. Now, in terms of our egos and thinking about our egos and what we should be careful of, I think the thing we need to be careful of is what Scripture says, and that is thinking too highly of ourselves. But I think in addition to that, we also need to be careful not to think too lowly of ourselves. And this is the trick. This is the difficulty. We need to think accurately about ourselves. And if you think too highly of yourself, you're in sin. You're irrational. If you think too lowly of yourself, though, you are in sin and irrational and likely going to make shipwreck of your life. And so what you need to do is to think rationally and accurately about yourself, which means you have to think about yourself. Now, that doesn't mean saying to yourself, me, all I care about is me, I don't care about anybody else or anything else in the world, because you are a being who lives in society and has to interact with reality, right? So when I say you should think accurately about yourself, the first thing that involves is thinking accurately about your position in reality and your relationship to everything else in reality and your relationship to other people in reality. First God and then other people, right? And so I think the problem is when we think about the ego or the self, we have an out of context and truncated view of the self. where we take the self to be, what am I feeling or thinking right now in the moment? And I think the healthier view is to think of the ego or the self as the enduring image of God that lives in reality as a spiritual physical being and has a specific nature and a specific design. And when you think of the ego or the self like that, it's a lot harder to run into those problems on one side or the other that we tend to run into. Does that help and answer the question, Tony?
Yes, it does.
Good.
Yep.
All right, Jacob, I'm going to ask you two more questions. And these questions are, how important is, in the big picture of Christian life, the topic of Christian egoism? And then the next one is, what are we planning to do about it For the New Christian Intellectual?
How important is Christian egoism in the big picture of the Christian life? For the same reasons that I think Piper would say about his Christian hedonism, it is supremely important. Because at least the hedonism element of genuinely valuing the glory of God, because that's necessary for actual genuine worship, you can't get rid of that or bypass that without offending God, without saying implicitly, God is not valuable to me. I don't care about God's glory, right? And you can go to Piper to get a lot more on that. But I think in addition to that, it's extremely important for the other leg of what we've been talking about, namely objectively valuing the self, for all the reasons that we've talked about. The entire Christian life is meant to be a life of self-control and self-care, where you are the steward of your life, of your body, of your mind, of your affections, of your entire self. You alone are responsible for that. You alone will stand in a single file line before God. You don't get to hide behind the excuses of what other people did to you or what other people said or what tradition said. We won't get to hide behind any of those excuses when we give an account for what we did with our lives. And just as importantly, we won't be able to hide behind those excuses in our own consciences. We may be able to evade our own responsibilities in the here and now with with nice distractions, but God will take away those distractions and torment us with the reality of the guilt that we rightly deserve if we try to go about life in a way that evades that responsibility. So I think this is extremely important for the Christian life, for the Christian witness, and for glorifying God in all of life. I really don't think that you can have genuine Christianity that teaches explicitly and consistently against Christian egoism. And that's just the Christian life. That's not even talking about the theological implications, which we've talked about in the past, because there are serious theological implications that end up denying the gospel and denying the heart of God's passion for his own glory if you accept the idea that self-interest is essentially or inherently evil, right? Go ahead, Cody.
So my question of, how important is this Christian egoism concept? It amounts to saying, how important is it to have a right understanding of what morality even means? And how important is it to live a Christian life with clear, uncluttered motivation and rational thinking? It's so important. So that takes us to, what are we doing For the New Christian Intellectual? Can you summarize why we even started this whole exercise, this whole project?
Well, to speak to Shireen's concern, we started this to give voice to those people who had these convictions but didn't know how to formulate them, to give it offense for those people who had these convictions or who were groping for these convictions but didn't know how to defend them, and to set on a hill, so to speak, these convictions to teach to others so that future generations, like your children, Shireen, would have resources to learn from, and to combat the evil, altruistic, and irrational forces that are rampant in the culture today, right? So there's no one else talking about these things, with the possible exception of Piper, but I don't think Piper's fully consistent, as we've talked about quite a bit. There's no one else talking about these things, and most people, even when they listen to Piper, they kind of reluctantly agree with him, right? It's like they feel like they have to pay lip service to Piper's Christian hedonism because he's Piper, but you get the sense that they wish he'd hurry up and die so they could just forget about this whole Christian hedonism thing. Right? At least that's a sense I've gotten from a large majority of people who claim to respect Piper. There are some, thankfully, who really take his Christian hedonism to heart. But this is something that needs a strong and vibrant voice in the Christian community and in American culture. And apart from that, the prospects are pretty dim in terms of what the future looks like, for those who want to genuinely worship God and genuinely spread true Christianity.
So one of the most important implications of Christian egoism, if it is true, is that it's something that is worth defending. And so, Jacob, you spoke a little bit to me about the importance of investing in either getting your own message out there or working together with a group like For the New Christian Intellectual or starting your own. But the point is to find, identify, promote your essential values, support those values. And that doesn't just include financial ways. That includes living your own life in the way that Piper describes. He says you should live in a wartime mindset to some degree, not because war is great, but because if you look around rationally and you just think about the way the world is right now, we are in an ideological war. So do you want to be winning that war? And so I would encourage everybody that's watching this video live and the people that watch it later, think about whether you can be a writer, think about whether you can be a teacher, think about whether you can help with projects or start projects that are getting these ideas out to people. A couple of calls to action. One is consider bringing Jacob Brunton to be a speaker at your event to talk about this idea. Another is explore our YouTube channel, which you can find at christianintellectual.com/YouTube. And also, I would just encourage you to join all of our podcasts, educate yourself. We're trying to be teachers on this topic. So until someone else comes along and can teach it better than us, I want you to study all of our material, and then I want you to become an even better teacher. The name of the organization is For the New Christian Intellectual. In other words, for you. So go to our podcast, especially check out episodes 4, 5, and 6, because that's where we summarize these issues, I think, most clearly. Jacob, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to drive that home. Being a Christian egoist means pursuing your values and pursuing them to the nth degree. And that means investing in your values, investing in the future of your values, right? So, and that's not just for us, although it includes us. I'm not going to be shy about that. We need your money. We need your prayers. We need your support. But in addition to that, if you really value Ligonier Ministries and their spreading of classical Christian teaching, you need to go support them, even if it's just by praying for them. Right? If you're at a church where they are preaching the gospel faithfully and they are promoting what you count as supremely valuable, you need to be supporting them in prayer and in service and financially, right? If you value the Ayn Rand Institute and what they're doing and you think that that's the best place for your funds to go, you need to be supporting them. The point is, being an egoist is a long-term, long-range affair. It's being future-oriented. It's thinking about not just the here and now, but a decade from now and 2 decades from now and 3 generations from now. It's thinking about the kind of life that your children are going to have and that your grandchildren are going to have. What's the trajectory of the world? What's the trajectory of the country? What's the trajectory of the church? And how can you be a part of changing that? How can you invest in making sure that God is glorified to the max as a result of your life, even if it doesn't happen in your life, right? So and so the point is, our calling is to find ways that we can plug into those types of things. And if it's not just through your own career, it can be through supporting and praying for and serving in and through institutions that are promoting those values and that are going to make that long-term impact.
Cool. Jacob, thank you for having the passion and for being able to articulate these values. I would like to say thank you for everyone joining the call today, and the replay will be available. So I hope you all have a great day, and I'll look forward to talking with you soon.